I'm a Black feminist anthropologist by training. So Zora Neale Hurston, hopefully y'all know who Zora Neale Hurston was, is always one of my favorite elder references. In her great novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, originally published in 1937, she writes, "If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it." I could not stand in front of you today and be silent about our pain. This is a nation soaked with the blood of many people in this soil. So let me get started and just say thank you. I want to say thank you to the Library Publishing Coalition for inviting me to be here today. I want to say thank you to Sonia Betts, who's just been awesome and amazing and just patient with me, because anthropologists and librarians move on different, I feel like we're in different time zones. And so I just appreciate the patience with the time of anthropology, which is slow and forgetful. And also want to thank Nancy Adams, and I don't know if I see Nancy, but I want to say thank you to Nancy Adams as well, and everybody who has just helped to put all of this together. I know it is a lot to come into this space after such a stressful year, after such a stressful 2 years of a pandemic that we thought was going to last a couple months, and then we look up and it's been 2 years and we're like, oh my God, what's happening with our lives? Oh dear. So it's a lot for us to be here, and I just want to say thank you to that. I actually, and I promise I won't have a heavy tone the whole time. It's just that it's tough right now. I want to start with a quote. As I was preparing to come and hang out with you all today, I was thinking back through the people who've inspired me, and I thought immediately to Toni Morrison, because when I think about the work that libraries do and the work that librarians do, I think about Toni Morrison's love for writing and reading and knowledge. And I want to share with you a quote to start off. She wrote, "There is a certain kind of peace that is not merely the absence of war. It is larger than that. The peace I am thinking of is not at the mercy, of history's rule, nor is it a passive surrender to the status quo. The peace I am thinking of is the dance of an open mind when it engages another equally open one. An activity that occurs most naturally, most often in the reading, writing world we live in. Accessible as it is, this particular kind of peace warrants vigilance. The peril it faces comes not from the computers and information highways that raise alarm among book readers, but from unrecognized, more sinister quarters." End quote. On November 6, 1996, Toni Morrison accepted the Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters with the words that I just recited to you. Words that resonated then as much as they do now, 26 years later. During that speech, she continued with the following story. "I was in Strasbourg attending a meeting of a group called the Parliament of Writers. It is an organization committed to the aggressive rescue of persecuted writers. After one of the symposia, just outside of the doors of the hall, a woman approached me and asked me if I knew anything about the contemporary literature of her country. I said no, I knew nothing of it. We talked a few minutes more. Earlier, while listening to her speak on a panel, I had been awestruck by her articulateness, the ease with which she moved among languages, and literatures, her familiarity with histories and nations, histories of criticisms, histories of authors. She knew my work, I knew nothing of hers. We continued to talk animatedly. And then, in the middle of it, she began to cry. No sobs, no heaving shoulders, just great tears rolling down her face. She did not wipe them away, and she did not loosen her gaze. You have to help us, she said. You have to help us. They're shooting us down in the street. By us, she meant those women who write against the grain. What can I do? I asked her. She said, I do not know, but you have to try. There isn't anybody else. The dance of the open mind is under imminent threat, and the danger is coming from sinister quarters. We need only to take a step back and look at the debate around critical race theory, around gender and sexuality, the threats to knowledge across this country, to know that we are under imminent threat. Indeed, the dance of the open mind is in the midst of a war. And I want to begin today by saying that you, librarians, the custodians of knowledge, are on the front lines of that war. So my question to you today is, what are you going to do? There isn't anybody else. According to Education Week, since January 2021, 42 states have introduced bills or taken other steps that would restrict teaching critical race theory or limit how teachers can discuss racism and sexism. 17 states have imposed these bans and restrictions either through legislation or other venues. In my adopted state of Texas, Governor Greg Abbott signed HB 3979 into law, prohibiting teachers from engaging in race or sex stereotyping, quote unquote, preventing schools from awarding credit for student service learning with advocacy groups, and banning schools from requiring teachers to discuss controversial issues. An updated version of the law, which is SB 3, passed in special session and went into effect in December. In addition to the requirements of HB 3979, SB 3 also mandates that teachers will go through a civics training program and that parents have access to schools' learning management systems. The Texas Education Agency has required that all new charter schools submit a, quote, statement of assurance that they will follow the new law. Here in the state of Pennsylvania, in June 2021, Representative Russ Diamond introduced a bill that would limit how teachers can discuss racism and sexism and ban schools from hosting speakers or assigning books that advocate racist or sexist concepts, quote unquote. And I'm putting all these things in quote because they're dog whistles, right? Everybody understands that. Okay, good. So at no time in our recent history, at least not in the history that I can remember, has knowledge been under this kind of threat. I know that I'm sure many of you saw the film 1987 or read the book 1987. And when I first read that back in high school, I kept thinking to myself, what a strange world where books are dangerous, where books are a threat. And yet here we are. And here we are as people who are responsible for introducing the world to books. Our libraries are now considered arsenals of rebellion. So what is it that we are going to do? How are we going to rise to this moment? I want to take a minute and backtrack a little bit to tell you who I am, because I kind of started to talk with you, but I didn't really tell you who I am. In 2017, I started Cite Black Women, an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary movement dedicated to highlighting the expertise of Black women scholars who are often undercut and undermined. It is a Black feminist intellectual project, Praxis, and global movement to decolonize the practice of citation by redressing the epistemic erasure of Black women from the literal and figurative bibliographies of the world. We affirm the values of creative genius that Black women writers and thinkers have brought into this world and continue to develop to this day. The mission of Cite Black Women is not just oriented around the promotion of Black feminist thought. Rather, it is also invested in promoting Black feminists doing the work of advancing intellectual thought in a variety of spaces and contexts. The Cite Black Women Collective includes queer, femme, and gender nonconforming people, produces a podcast, and is engaged in several research and pedagogical projects. We have 5 guiding principles that undergird our movement. Read Black women's work, Integrate Black women into the core of your syllabus in the life and classroom. Acknowledge Black women's intellectual production. Make space for Black women to speak, and give Black women the space and time to breathe. I want to take a few minutes and just kind of go over those because I think that they're really important. So number one, read Black women's work. There's a statement from the Combahee River Collective that we've been inspired by, and it is the following. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. Many times when I talk about Cite Black women, people say, well, why Black women? Why not everybody? And I definitely sympathize with that, and I understand why people would make that question. But part of the reason why we focus on Black women is because we realize that in order to address the issues of erasure around Black women, we have to address the issues of erasure that are structural in our society. And so when we think about Black women and we focus on Black women, it forces us to change the way that we understand and see the world. It forces us to question the normative ways that we approach knowledge production and knowledge consumption. So that's where that comes from. And to start with that, we have to read our work. You have to know what we're saying. You have to know what we're talking about. And as simple as that may seem, many people don't take that step. And so that's why that's the first principle. 2 is integrate Black women into the core of your syllabus in the life and the classroom. Being deliberate about not just mentioning Black women, but also taking our ideas seriously and allowing our ideas to shape how you fundamentally see and relate the world is critical to this project. And I want to underscore that because, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, and I'm going to make sure I am aware of my time. That's why I have my phone up here. I want to underscore this because many times when we're talking about bibliographies, and whether we're talking to researchers or faculty or journalists or students, et cetera, people often turn to their bibliographies and start to count and say, well, look at how many people I'm engaging. But if you're not engaging with the ideas seriously, if you're not taking our ideas seriously, if you're not actually allowing the ideas of Black women to change the way that you see the world, then you're not doing the work. And so this particular principle is all about recognizing that putting us on a laundry list with everybody else is not enough. You have to do the work. You have to take a minute and do the work. Number 3 is acknowledge Black women's intellectual production. So taking the time out to clearly express credit for our work is extremely important. Again, this may seem simple, and I'll go back over this in a minute. This may seem simple, but the fact of the matter is, there are many times when our work is simply casually appropriated or casually mentioned and talked about and not acknowledged. A really beautiful example actually happened to me the other day when I was surfing through Instagram, which is what I do to detox from life. Watching cat memes. I particularly like cat memes. So if you have good cat memes, please send them to me. I love them, especially cats and dogs getting along. That's one of the ones that I really love. It warms my heart. And as I was going through it, I was looking at something that was really powerful when somebody was talking about a critique of self-care. And the fact that we need to shift from thinking about self-care to community care. And it was a really beautiful reflection from a very, very nice white man who I don't know. And I was very moved by it. And also shocked. Because Miriam Kaba writes about that concept in her book, How We Got Free, which was published last year. There was no mention of Kaba or her work. These kinds of casual references to concepts that we produce without acknowledgement of the sources seems relatively innocuous. But in actuality, what it does is compound our erasure over time. And I want to really underscore that because that is part of a larger system of violence that I want to talk about as well. Number 4 is make space for Black women to speak, right? I'm here now, thank you so much. You made space for me, I appreciate that. But part of the reason why this is up there as well is primarily because of what I just said. Sometimes We have wonderful ideas. People are citing our ideas, but they don't give us the opportunity to actually speak for ourselves. And that's extremely important because our voices need to be heard and our bodies need to be seen. Let me say that again. Our voices need to be heard and our bodies need to be seen. We make people uncomfortable. We know that. But by bringing us into spaces where we are not normally present, we are invoking not only ourselves, but those of us that are outside of this space that may or may not have access to it. And give Black women the space and time to breathe. I love this one because one of the things that inevitably happens when we're talking about these principles is that people start to say, well, tell me, give me a syllabus, give me a database. Can you create this thing for me? And I'm like, you know, I got 2 kids. I'm sitting here like trying to run a center. I can't breathe or spell my name straight. It's hard for me to do extra labor. And so the reason why it's important to give us space and time to breathe is primarily because we are doing a lot of work. And we need you all to be allies. We need you all to support us. And we need you all to carry us with you on this journey. But we do not need anybody to ask us to do everything. Now, why am I starting with those principles? Because I want you to keep them in the back of your mind. It's early in the morning, everybody's getting their coffee. I hope by the end of the time that we start talking today, that all of these things will start to make even more sense. But I want you to keep them in the back of your mind because I actually want to continue by telling a little story. The following is a brief excerpt of an essay that I just published for Cultural Anthropology. And it helps to frame the stakes of this project. This is a note on violence. I wrote my first book with a newborn in my hand. I would wake up at 3 a.m. every morning and sneak out of bed while my son was sleeping to go to my office and squeeze in a couple of hours of writing before starting the workday. Sometimes he would wake up and I would get my nursing pillow and breastfeed him on my lap while I stretched my arms out over him to type on my laptop. Words mingled with milk in the twilight hours to create life. I nursed my words with my child, becoming a mother and a writer at the same time. I know my words like I know my children because I birthed them too. Fast forward. My book is out in the world and my child is walking. I'm attending a conference with scholars working on similar topics to mine. I head to the back of the conference hall to grab a coffee only to see quite unexpectedly concepts for my book paraphrased by someone I did not know on a PowerPoint projected at the front of the conference hall. There was a painful tug in my throat and my heart, and my eyes began to burn. I felt like someone had taken something dear from me without my permission. My words, twisted yet recognizable, sat in front of me without my permission, and I felt violated. There's an intimate relationship between citational erasure and violence. That moment at a conference in 2017 was not the first time that I had been targeted by plagiarism. It was, however, the moment that inspired me to action and to think critically about the politics of citational erasure and its intimate relationship with anti-Blackness, misogyny, patriarchy, and the politics of power within the academy. A prior experience with plagiarism, an experience that caught me quite off guard, not only forever changed my approach to my work, but also continues to haunt me almost a decade later. In 2012, a student plagiarized my work, and when I tried to bring it to the attention of my senior colleagues, I was dismissed and gaslighted. For the next 5 years, I was professionally intimidated, maligned, and blackballed by a small circle of people intent on punishing me for daring to claim that I had had my ideas stolen. As a result, I became withdrawn and consumed by self-doubt. I tried to simply press on with my work, only to have the situation reappear from time to time to torment me. Citational erasure is not just an intellectual matter. It is also a question of power that is inextricably intertwined with the dynamics of patriarchy and misogyny inside and outside of the academy. If we understand citation to be the rules, practices, beliefs, and principles that define the genealogical map of our thoughts and interpretations, then citation is not only about inclusion in a bibliography, but also about the ways that we reference our work and the ways that we reference others in relation to our work. It is also the way that we acknowledge the intellectual labor that provides the context necessary for our work to exist. It is not an exhaustive art. We never acknowledge all of the multiple strands of thought that construct our ideas simply because they are usually too vast to name. Consequently, citation is also a deliberate political act, a decision to mark another's thinking as foundational and or influential to our own, or to chart the existing discourse on a topic that we believe is critical to the field. In this sense, citation is also intellectual currency. During my third year as an undergraduate student anthropology major, I was enrolled in a required course on anthropological theory. It was my first core anthropology course, and I was eager to learn about this mysterious discipline that seemed to fit my interest, but was unknown to me prior to starting college. And actually, my coming to anthropology is a hilarious story, which I will tell if anybody wants me to tell it, but I will tell it later. However, my first class took me by surprise. Although we were reading diverse texts about world cultures, including a number by, of feminist anthropology texts, none of the assigned authors were Black. Naively, I approached my professor after class one day and asked her what I thought was a completely innocuous question. Are there any Black anthropologists? She flushed and curtly replied, well, of course there are. She proceeded to suggest that I read the recently published book, Women Writing Culture, which came out in 1995 and was edited by Ruth Behar and Deborah Gordon. I picked the book up from the library that day and began. The experience reassured me that anthropology could be for me. In it, I found Faye Harrison's 1995 essay, Writing Against the Grain, which is, I think, inspired by Toni Morrison's speech that I just quoted at the beginning. The cultural politics of difference in the work of Alice Walker. I learned my path. Hold on one second. From Zora Neale Hurston to Alice Walker, Black women who had been alienated by anthropology as a field turned to writing literature to engage with African diaspora cultures and think critically about sociopolitical and cultural realities for Black people globally, just like I had done. I also learned with my question that left my professor flustered, that Black people, and specifically Black women, had indeed been historically erased from the canon of anthropology despite conducting far-reaching ethnographic work and writing. So a question, what does it mean to dismantle the patriarchal, white supremacist, heterosexist, imperialist impetus of the neoliberal university and its accomplices by centering Black women's ideas and intellectual contributions? What are the ways that we can reclaim, reaffirm, and re-articulate Black women, both inside and outside of the academy, as producers of knowledge? And why is this reclamation important, even in spaces like this? So in order to answer this question, I want to think about citation. Why does citation matter? Although it may seem that citation is relatively innocuous, distant from violence, it is in actuality, as I've mentioned, a field of power that is deeply implicated in contemporary histories and lived realities of racialized and sexualized violence. Indeed, citation, the act of acknowledging genealogies of thought and ideas, has historically been a site of contestation inside and outside of the university, in part because of the deep relationship between the production of knowledge and structures of power. In other words, epistemology. Citational politics are a reflection of the broader politics at play in our global society, and in this sense, they are a contested zone. So I think about this in terms of kind of a brief chart. If citation is the way that we acknowledge the genealogy of our ideas, then it is also a system of acknowledgement that affirms humanity by recognizing the importance of individual and collective contributions to the world. It's also an archive. And all of these things are interconnected. So in this day and age, when information is being proliferated through social media and new media, citation is even more important as a way to ensure equity as we continue to find ways to share information. And considering that this particular group is a group whose purpose is to share information, then citation is a fundamental aspect of your work. Citation is a fundamental politics of any librarian's job, of any publishing forum's job, of any work that we do to democratize knowledge. So in 1997, Yolanda Moses, who was also an anthropologist and former president of the American Anthropological Association meetings, wrote the following. She said, Black women have been participants in higher education for more than a century, but they are almost totally absent from the research literature, and rarely is the impact of racism and sexism on Black women in academia examined. It wasn't until I started to do this work that I realized that for generations, Black women scholars have talked about our erasure, have talked about the ways that we produce scholarship, that scholarship is consumed, and then almost immediately it is completely erased from the archive. And it's not to say that it doesn't exist in the archive, because you as librarians know that there are books that are in the stacks. But the question is, how do we get people from the knowledge that they're seeking to the books that are there? How do we direct people to these texts? And how do we bring Black women in particular out of the shadows of the archives? So I talked about the intellectual genealogy for Cite Black women, and I want to go back to the Combahee River Collective. And for many Black feminists, the Combahee River Collective is really kind of an inaugural group that started. The Combahee River Collective statement was published in 1977. The group started to form between the years of 1974 and 1977, and included most notably Barbara Smith, who is a leading Black feminist scholar, for those who may not know. And in that text, they talk about being actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, and class oppression, and seeing as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. And so recognizing that, the work that we're trying to do at Cite Black Women is to think about how we can map these interlocking forms of oppression. And again, recognizing that if we're mapping interlocking forms of oppression and we're paying attention to how to redress the erasure of Black women, then we will begin to be able to redress some of the inequalities, the structural inequalities that we find throughout. Because if Black women were free, it would be that everyone else would be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. Sorry, my throat is a little bit stuck. That would be wonderful. So I also want to give you a bit of the research behind this, because another thing that happens is kind of colloquially, we know that, or we feel that Black women are not being acknowledged. But in 2021, I published an article with my graduate research assistant, Dominique Garrett Scott, looking at, thank you so much. Looking at rates of citation for Black women in top tier anthropology journals. And in that, what we found was the following. When we did an audit of the representation of Black women in the bibliographies of 61 articles in top tier anthropology journals, we analyzed 5,445 citations. Of these citations, Black women only constituted about 1.5%, or 82 citations out of 5,445. 82 citations out of 5,445. Now, I think it's important to note, excuse me, because I'm not a quantitative anthropologist, so I had to tap into my sociology quantitative friends to be able to help me with this, so that there is a lot of, one, Dominique Garrett-Scott is a PhD candidate in sociology at UT, and so does that work as well. But we also vetted this with folk who do quantitative analysis. And so one of the things that's important to note is that Black women make up about 2.6% of anthropologists in the United States. So even at 1.5% of the overall citations, that's still an underrepresentation, right? It's still an underrepresentation. But the underrepresentation, when we compare apples with apples and not apples with, I don't know, all fruit, right, is even more stark. So when I say 1.5%, I'm talking about all citations for all Black women in anthropology in those bibliographies. And so those are any Black women who are cited in that list. That doesn't mean that they're anthropologists. So if we're going to compare it to the percentage of anthropologists, we need to compare Black women anthropologists who are cited with the percentage of anthropologists, Black women anthropologists overall. And when we do that work, the number drops precipitously to 0.84%. So only 0.84% of all of those citations, of all of the citations included, were of Black women anthropologists. And that is an absolute underrepresentation. Okay? Does everybody understand that? And obviously this is a pilot study. And so we're hoping to be able to expand this. But even this little slither allows us to see some of the issues that are at hand here. Hold on. So the results of our study reflect a broader, deeper trend in the way that we recognize and value knowledge production. Lurking behind the otherwise inspiring moment of revelation that I had in college when I discovered Black women anthropologists was a nagging issue that remains a concern for me. Why are Black women, still not included in the canon of many academic literature fields, despite decades of important scholarship, like my own anthropology? It seems like every generation of young Black women scholars goes through a learning experience similar to mine. The experience repeats itself precisely because of the university's entrenched epistemological relationship to patriarchal white supremacy and its refusal to grapple with its relationship over time. We as Black women are symbolically included in the project of academic knowledge production, but we are epistemologically erased, considered auxiliaries to the intellectual project. And I say symbolically included because despite our periodic prominent leadership roles within the academy as chief officers of diversity, deans, et cetera, we still experience a pervasive sense of marginalization in the academy, and that marginalization is intellectual. Much in the way that Black women have occupied the role of the help, quote unquote, globally since the colonialism slavery period, we continue to be cast as service providers, but not as thinkers within the field. To say this is not to belittle the important value that Black women's labor plays, but to rather acknowledge the disconnect between embracing Black women as service workers and ignoring us as theorists and intellectuals. We have been strip mined for our knowledge and given little, if any, credit for the immeasurable intellectual contributions we have made. I use this phrase, strip mined, carefully and deliberately for its colonial, environmental, and sexual overtones. It is the case that citational erasure of Black women cannot be separated from the racialized and sexualized structures of power that frame the academy writ large. The same gender sexualized discourses that mark women, and particularly Black women and subjugated women of color, as violable and rapeable subjects in our society also mark us as violable epistemologically. In other words, one of the things that I talk about in my work on citation is the intersection between sexual violence, gender violence, and citational erasure in the academy. the structure of patriarchy that permits women to be viable and exploitable within university settings, as with exploitative relationships between professors and students, also mark our ideas as takeable as well. Within the context of the neoliberal university and the increasing commodification and branding of knowledge production, compelling ideas and phrases have become commodities to be fetishized and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Excuse me. Sorry. Ideas are capital, deeply imbricated in the logic of racial patriarchal capitalism. The ownership of ideas is also a field of power. We must map citational erasure onto the genealogical map of colonialism and slavery, the very proposal that ideas are property to be bought, sold, fenced in, and possessed follows settler colonial logics of conquest, seizure, and appropriation. It also follows the logics of extractive labor production and have deep continuities with the logics of slavery. To follow, as with settler colonial approaches to land that erase the histories of prior indigenous inhabitation in order to legitimate taking, occupying, exploiting, and polluting indigenous lands by claiming they were previously uninhabited, citational erasure depends on similar assumptions about the absence of prior owners, or in this case, authors. In this sense, the violence is less about the generation of ideas and more about the dehumanizing logics that must be enacted in order to claim ownership of an idea and dissociate it from the people who previously shared it. Citation is a question of value. If our disciplines are our intellectual societies, then citation is a question of citizenship and belonging. To be cited is to belong to the intellectual polity. Citational politics are the rules, practices, beliefs, and principles by which we determine how we publicly map the genealogy of our thoughts and inspiration. They are much more than mere mentions. They determine how our disciplines both value our work and evaluate us as scholars. Citations determine whether we are perceived as intellectual subjects or objects. So I've said a lot about the history of citation, about the politics of citation, about the relationships with violence, about my own experiences with this whole thing. And so the question then comes back to the question that I asked at the beginning. So what are we going to do? I thought a lot about this because I did not want to come here without a set of action items that you all could think about. And at the very least, consider adopting or work through or think through as we move forward. And so I want to close today by making a call to action. As librarians, you have a great deal of power in shaping the ways that our society accesses knowledge. When researchers and the curious come into your library spaces, they are hungry for information, even if they are not quite sure what they're seeking. So here's what I think you can do. 1, teach students and everyone that identity politics matter when it comes to citation. Citations are always implicated in the politics of race, gender, sexuality, etc. I know this seems, identity politics has become this phrase that has been demonized in our society. And most of the people who demonize it use it as a way to try to say that people are trying to get free tokens or something like that, without actually acknowledging the source of that particular phrase, which comes from the Combahee River Collective, which was a call to remind us that the personal is political. Who we are matters, and it influences every part of our life. And so when we teach students that authors' identity has everything to do with how they got to where they got to, whether or not we're reading them, and what impact they have, then we are not doing those authors a disservice. What we're doing is acknowledging all of the genealogies of power and history that are sometimes invisible to the students that we come into contact with. The second thing I would say is teach students and everyone that citation is not just about listening to people in a bibliography or listing people in a bibliography. It is also about creating genealogies of thought that are steeped in the politics of power and knowledge production. Undoing oppressive power dynamics starts by rethinking the way we structure our bibliographies and knowledge. Number 3 would be teach people to be critical of knowledge assumptions and canons. I think a lot of times, you know, in the academy in particular, but also outside of the academy, who we cite becomes this badge of our intelligence. And so you sprinkle a little bit Foucault in here, you put a little bit of Kant over there, and all of a sudden, poof, you're smart. And I think part of what we need to do is start to push back and say, you know what's really smart? What's really smart is going deep and starting to uncover all of the different kinds of knowledges that have been produced about this topic and all of the different buried knowledges that we may all not know about, but that are important. We need to start teaching students to valorize understanding and discovering new kinds of knowledges that are undercited, that are underrepresented. That's the kind of work that we need to be valorizing, that we need to be lifting up, right? And so I think that that's something that folk can do as well. Number 4, and again, I'll admit that a lot of these I started to edit at like 1 o'clock in the morning because that's how my brain works. But I thought about the need to decolonize your stacks. And I don't know if somebody said that before, but it's cool. And I think it's an important thing to say, decolonize your stacks. And what do I mean by that? Is create a database, formal or informal, because databases are a lot of work, of Black women writing in every field. A lot of people have asked Cite Black women to do this. The reason why we haven't been able to do it is because we just don't have the capacity. But one of the things that I started to think was, if we all informally started to crowdsource this kind of databasing, if we all started to do this work little by little, then bit by bit, bite by bite, we could build something that would be really beautiful across the nation. And I think that librarians are really the people to be able to do that kind of work, because you all know more about what's in the stacks than anybody else. I would say be creative. And remember, again, what starts with Black women changes the world. So don't stop with Black women. What starts with Black women changes the world. Don't stop with Black women. Try it with Indigenous folk. Try it with folk who are trans. Figure out ways to be able to bring out these things, these kinds of knowledges that have been buried from inside your stacks and put them into people's hands. And finally, create ways to disrupt normative citational politics by developing curricula, community forums, crowdsourcing, etc. Being collaborative and innovative are 2 things that I think are absolutely crucial. And show students how to critically engage in research searches in a mindful, reflective way. So I want to actually leave you today with a really nice note that I got from a colleague who at Seattle Central College, her name is Helena Ribeiro. And she wrote this long email, which I'm not going to read the whole email, but I am going to read a bit of it, that broke down why this project is important for her in her work teaching English at Seattle Central, but also for her libraries. And I was hoping, and I'm hoping in sharing this, that it can be a bit of an inspiration. She wrote to me the following. Dear Christen, over the last few months, our librarians have been adopting Cite Black Women. The critical statement, which is our critical statement that we published last year, as well as the call to action as the backbone of their instruction for teaching students how and why to cite. They have been creating online modules and in-person lesson plans that start with the critical statement, and the response from students has been delightful. As you know, citation in general is super tough for undergrads, and they get all caught up on where to put commas instead of thinking about why they're doing what they are doing. By starting with the history and politics of how we cite, who we cite, and how we should be citing, and why, students get it right away. And they get really fired up about the kind of work they didn't know they could be doing in college. I teach in the English department, and our English 102 class is research-based composition and a requirement for most students. Because we have to do boring accreditation work and assessments and stuff, the English department had to commit to choosing one of the learning outcomes for this year. We have recently revamped our student learning outcomes for English 102 to include things like understand how power shapes the sources and voices, and understand how power shapes which sources and voices are amplified, and how to rebalance power by incorporating marginalized sources and voices into students' compositions, end quote. We have chosen that particular outcome as the one all faculty will be assessing in their English 102 courses this year and built an assessment activity around it. The idea is to assess particular outcomes straight out of Cite Black Women and the critical statement and other text and media from Cite Black Women. Independent of assessment activities, in my own English 102 class, which centers around manifestos as a starting point for researching social, cultural, political movements, I've adopted the critical statement as the first manifesto we read. I just taught it yesterday for the first time and the students loved it. There was an expletive there, but I'm not gonna say that part. Because the statement walks the walk, it's walking about in terms of citations. We spent the whole class period examining what makes the critical statement a manifesto, what its argument is, what it's based on, as well as making note of all the ways it cites its sources, narratively as well as in the text. If we had had more time, I would have pointed out how, in the context of the text, the bibliography serves not as a static, perfunctory checklist, but as a critical starting point for the call to action as well. Praxis. Anyway, it's a rich, expletive text. And I am so, so grateful that the collective exists, has done this thinking, and has put it in the world. We're also excited about it. We're also so excited about it, that I want to make sure that you knew that Cite Black Women is foundational at Seattle Central and will be at other colleges and university libraries as well. So with that, I want to say thank you. And I want to say, I hope you can join me in doing the work. Thank you so much.